Some nights the sky holds a kind of stillness that has no name. You can feel it more than see it. A quiet, pressing softness above the rooftops, above the trees, above everything that stands still enough to notice it. If this feels like a good place to rest tonight, you are welcome to stay. Now, let's drift. There is something above you right now that you have never truly touched and never truly seen, and yet it has touched every single breath you have ever taken. It has no colour of its own. It has no shape you could hold, and still it wraps around the entire earth like something patient, something old, something that has simply always been there. Scientists call it the atmosphere. But tonight, let's forget the word for a moment and just imagine the feeling of it. A thin, invisible layer of air stretching upward for hundreds of miles, thinning and thinning, until it quietly fades into the dark stillness of space. It seems that most of us go entire lifetimes without ever really wondering what it is made of or why it stays where it is, or what would happen if one quiet day it simply wasn't there anymore. That is where we will drift tonight. Gently, slowly, not to frighten, only to wonder. Researchers have found that the air around you right now is mostly nitrogen, a soft, quiet gas that makes up about 78% of what you are breathing at this very moment. It does not burn, it does not bark. It simply exists, filling the spaces between everything, holding the sky together in a way that feels almost like a long, slow exhale. Only about 21% of that air is oxygen, the part your body actually reaches for with every breath. And the rest, a small quiet fraction, is made of other things, argon, carbon dioxide. Faint traces of gases so small in number that they barely seem to matter at all. And yet somehow they do. The brain tends to interpret air as nothing, as empty space, as the absence of something rather than the presence of it. But it is not empty, not even close. Right now above your head, trillions upon trillions of tiny molecules are moving, colliding, drifting, holding a kind of invisible architecture that keeps the entire planet breathable. There is something oddly comforting in that. A structure you cannot see holding steady night after night without asking for anything in return. Some scientists believe this layer of air did not always look the way it does now. Long before anyone, the early atmosphere of this planet was almost unrecognizable, thick with different gases shaped by the volcanic breath and the slow churn of a much younger Earth. Over billions of years it shifted. It changed. Tiny living things, far too small to see, began quietly releasing oxygen into the air one small breath at a time, until the sky above became something we could finally live inside of. It is a strange thought to sit with, that the air filling your lungs right now carries a kind of memory, a slow, patient history stretching back further than imagination usually reaches. And still, for something so essential, so constant, the atmosphere remains almost impossibly thin. If you could shrink the Earth down to the size of an apple, the layer of breathable air around it would be thinner than the apple's own skin. That is all that separates the softness of this moment, the quiet of your room, the weight of your blanket, the low hum of the night, from the cold, silent vacuum just beyond it. Studies indicate that most of the air we breathe, the part that truly matters, sits within just a few miles above the ground. Beyond that, it thins so gradually that there is no single line where air ends and space begins. It simply fades the way a sound fades into silence or the way a thought fades into sleep. Psychologists often note that the mind finds comfort in things that surround it completely. A blanket, a warm room, a familiar sound in the background. Perhaps that is part of why the sky itself, without us ever fully realizing it, has always felt like a kind of shelter. Something wrapped around us, something we have simply trusted without needing to understand it. But what would happen if that shelter loosened? If somehow, quietly without warning, it began to slip away? Not tonight, not in this drifting hour, but somewhere ahead in the slow unfolding of this story, we will let ourselves wonder what the world would feel like without the soft weight of air above it, what the sky would look like, what the silence would sound like, what the body itself would quietly begin to notice first. For now, there is no need to reach for that. No need to hurry toward any answer. For now, it is enough to simply notice that you are breathing, that somewhere above you an invisible layer of gas is holding steady the way it always has, the way it likely will for a long time yet. The mind quietly registers safety in patterns like this, in things that repeat, in things that hold. And so for a little while longer, let the atmosphere simply be what it has always been, unseen, unspoken, quietly present. And somewhere in that quiet presence there is a shape beginning to form, not one we need to chase, only one we might drift toward a little later, a little further into the night. There is something quiet happening above you right now that most people never think to notice. The air is moving, not in the way wind moves, not in gusts or gales, but in a much slower, much older rhythm, a kind of breathing that the whole planet seems to share. Researchers have found that the atmosphere is not simply sitting still around the Earth like a blanket draped over a shoulder. It moves in great slow currents rising near the equator, where the sun warms it most, drifting toward the poles, cooling, sinking and beginning the journey again. This pattern has a name, atmospheric circulation, but the name matters far less than the feeling of it. A planet breathing in long, unhurried cycles that take days, weeks, sometimes months to complete a single turn. It may be that this is part of why the sky always feels alive even on the stillest of nights. Somewhere above you air is always moving, always circling, carrying warmth from one place to another, carrying moisture, carrying the invisible weight of weather still forming. But before we drift into movement, there is an older story worth sitting with for a moment. A story about breath itself, and where the air first learned to hold the kind of oxygen your lungs are reaching for right now. Billions of years ago, the air above this planet held almost none of it. The early atmosphere was heavier with other gases, closer to something you or I could not have survived even a single breath of. And then quietly, without any dramatic turn, something small began to change everything. Tiny organisms floating in ancient oceans began using sunlight to make their own food, a process we now call photosynthesis. As a quiet side effect of that process, they released oxygen. Not much at first, just a faint trace drifting up from the water into the young and unready sky. For a long time, that oxygen had almost nowhere to go. It seems that the early oceans and rocks absorbed most of it the way a dry towel absorbs water before anything spills over. But the small organisms kept producing it patiently, endlessly for hundreds of millions of years, and slowly the towel became soaked. The oxygen began rising into the air in greater and greater amounts until it reshaped the entire atmosphere around it. Scientists often call this shift the Great Oxidation, a name that sounds larger than the process actually felt because nothing about it happened quickly. It unfolded across a span of time so long that human minds were never built to hold it comfortably. And yet that slow unfolding is the quiet reason you are able to breathe at all tonight. There is something oddly moving in that the air filling your chest right now began as something almost accidental, a byproduct of tiny living things simply existing, simply doing what they were built to do, never knowing they were shaping the sky for everything that would come after them. The mind quietly registers stories like this differently than it registers facts. A fact says oxygen makes up about 21% of the atmosphere. A story says something small and quiet gave you the ability to be here breathing right now without ever asking to be thanked. Perhaps it is enough tonight to simply notice that quiet kind of gratitude without needing to do anything with it. Now, if we let ourselves drift a little further upward past the air, you are breathing past the clouds, past the place where birds stop flying. The atmosphere does not simply stop. It changes. It layers. Evidence suggests the atmosphere is built from several distinct layers stacked gently on top of one another, like something folded rather than poured. Closest to the ground is the troposphere, the layer that holds nearly all of the weather you have ever felt. The rain against a window, the wind that moves through trees at night, the soft press of humidity before a storm. All of it happens here in this lowest, thickest band of air, usually no more than about 7 or 8 miles above your head. Above that sits the stratosphere, a calmer, more settled layer, where the air grows thinner and the temperature behaves almost backward, growing slightly warmer instead of colder the higher it climbs. It is here researchers note that a delicate layer of ozone quietly gathers, not thick, not dense, but enough to absorb much of the sun's more intense radiation before it ever reaches the ground. Higher still the layers grow thinner and stranger, the mesosphere, the thermosphere, each one fading further into the dark hush of space, until the very idea of air becomes almost symbolic rather than physical. A few scattered particles drifting alone further apart than sound could ever travel between them. Studies indicate that by the time you reach what scientists loosely call the edge of the atmosphere, roughly 62 miles up, the air has thinned so completely that it no longer behaves the way we understand air to behave down here. It is less a wall, more a suggestion, a slow fading rather than a line. There is something almost tender in that image, that the sky does not end abruptly the way a door closes, but rather drifts away gradually, the way a voice grows softer the further it travels until it simply becomes part of the silence surrounding it. The brain tends to prefer clear edges, clear beginnings, clear endings, but the atmosphere offers something gentler than that, a slow unwinding without any distinct point at which one thing becomes another. In a way, it moves the same way falling asleep does. There is no single moment where wakefulness stops and rest begins. It simply quietly lets go. There is one more part of this atmosphere's memory worth resting on for a moment before we let ourselves drift onward. Deep within layers of ancient ice in places like Antarctica and Greenland, scientists have found tiny bubbles of air trapped inside the frozen layers sealed away hundreds of thousands of years ago. Each bubble holds a small breath of the past, a sample of what the atmosphere actually contained long before anyone was alive to measure it. By studying these frozen breaths, researchers have been able to piece together how the atmosphere has shifted over time, how carbon dioxide levels have risen and fallen, how temperatures have moved in long, slow waves across hundreds of thousands of years. It is in a quiet way, as if the sky kept a diary and buried it in ice, waiting patiently for someone far in the future to finally read it. What we understand so far suggests that the atmosphere has never truly been still. It has shifted, adjusted, reshaped itself again and again, long before any human eye ever looked up and wondered what it was made of. And still, through all of that, shifting it has held. Balanced, breathable, wrapped gently around a small, blue planet, carrying warmth in one direction, moisture in another, oxygen quietly threaded through all of it. Maybe that is part of what makes the night sky feel so peaceful, not because nothing is happening up there, but because everything happening up there has learned somehow, across billions of years, how to hold itself gently. For now, there is nothing more to reach for. Only the quiet knowledge that somewhere above you ancient air is still moving in its old familiar rhythm, the same rhythm it has kept for longer than memory can hold. And soon, a little further into this slow unfolding night, we will begin to wonder what that rhythm is quietly protecting you from. A kind of shelter so constant you've likely never had a reason to think about it at all. There is a kind of protection that surrounds you every single night, so constant, so unbroken that it has never once asked for your attention. It does not announce itself. It does not need to. It simply holds quietly the way a hand rests gently against a shoulder without needing to press. Scientists suggest that this protection begins with something you have felt your whole life without ever really noticing it as protection at all: pressure. The air above you right now is pressing down gently, evenly at roughly 14.7 pounds across every square inch of your body. That is the ordinary weight of the sky. And yet you do not feel crushed by it, because your body has always known this pressure is always balanced against it from the inside, quietly, automatically, without a single conscious thought. It is only when that pressure changes even so slightly that the body seems to notice. The soft pop in your ears on an airplane, the light-headed feeling near the top of a tall mountain. These are small reminders that the air is not simply empty space, but something with real weight, real presence, holding everything gently in place. The mind quietly registers that kind of constant pressure as safety, even without understanding why. Psychologists often note that steady, unchanging sensations, a weighted blanket, a slow heartbeat beside you, the hum of a fan in another room, tend to soften the nervous system rather than alert it. In a way, the atmosphere has been doing exactly that for you every moment of every day, long before you ever noticed it as comfort. But pressure is only the beginning of what this thin layer of air quietly does for you. Above the place where weather lives, above the clouds and the wind and the rain, there is a much thinner, much quieter layer, one made of a molecule called ozone. It is delicate, spread so thin that if you gathered all of it together and pressed it down to the density of the air you are breathing right now, it would form a layer only a few millimeters thick, somewhere around the width of 2 stacked coins. And yet evidence suggests that this fragile, almost imaginary layer absorbs the majority of the sun's most intense ultraviolet radiation before it ever reaches the ground. Without it, the light falling across your skin on an ordinary afternoon would carry a very different weight. Sunlight would still feel like sunlight, warm, familiar, but underneath that warmth would be something far less gentle. It seems strange that something so thin could hold back something so vast, but researchers have found that a little can be more than enough if it is arranged the right way in the right place for a long enough time. Perhaps that is not so different from certain quiet forms of strength in general. Not loud, not thick, just precisely placed. There is another kind of shield too, one that has nothing to do with air at all, and everything to do with something moving deep beneath your feet. Far below the surface of the earth, in a churning core of molten iron and nickel, slow currents of liquid metal are constantly shifting, flowing, circling. This movement generates something invisible and enormous, a magnetic field stretching far out into space, wrapping around the entire planet like an unseen second layer of protection, quieter even than the atmosphere itself. Neuroscientists have observed that people rarely think about forces they cannot sense directly, even when those forces shape their lives completely. The magnetic field is one of those forces. You cannot feel it. You cannot see it. And yet without it, the solar wind, a constant stream of charged particles flowing outward from the sun, would slowly strip the atmosphere away particle by particle over long stretches of time. Instead, that magnetic field gently deflects most of it, curving the solar wind around the planet the way a smooth stone might part a stream of water, sending it flowing around rather than through. Some of those particles do slip past, funneled toward the poles where they collide with the upper atmosphere and glow into soft ribbons of green and violet light, what we call the aurora. A quiet, beautiful reminder that even the parts of this protection that fail a little fail gently and turn into something worth looking up at. It may be that the layered protection, the pressure of the air, the thin veil of ozone, the invisible magnetic field turning far below, has shaped something deeper in how we feel about the sky itself. Studies indicate that humans tend to associate open skies with a sense of safety and calm, more so than enclosed spaces. Perhaps some quiet ancestral part of the mind has always sensed that the openness above is not actually open at all, that it is layered, guarded, held. Even the small sudden streaks of light you might catch on a clear night, what most people call shooting stars, are part of this same quiet defense. Tiny fragments of rock and dust, some no larger than a grain of sand entering the atmosphere at extraordinary speed, are slowed and burned away by friction with the air long before they could ever reach the ground. What looks like a brief, beautiful accident in the sky is in a much quieter sense the atmosphere doing exactly what it has always done, catching what might otherwise fall too far. The brain tends to file these things away as background as simply the sky, without registering the layers of quiet architecture holding that sky together. But maybe tonight, just for a moment, it is worth letting that architecture come a little closer to awareness. Pressure resting gently against your skin, ozone thin and patient somewhere far above, a magnetic field turning slowly beneath everything, deflecting what it can and letting the rest drift gently into light. None of it asks to be noticed. None of it asks for anything at all, and there is a quieter layer to this still. One that has less to do with the sky pressing outward and much more to do with what the body has been quietly listening for all along. There is a particular kind of quiet that only exists at night. The low hum of a refrigerator somewhere down the hall, the faint whisper of wind against a window, the soft, almost imperceptible rush of your own breath. Most people never think of these sounds as anything remarkable. They are simply there, filling the background of being awake or nearly asleep. But it may be that even this quiet, this almost silence, is something far more fragile than it feels. Sound researchers have found is not something that exists on its own. It needs a medium to travel through, something physical, something made of particles close enough together to bump gently against one another, carrying vibration outward, the way a ripple carries itself across the surface of water. Air happens to be an extraordinarily good medium for this. Its molecules are packed just closely enough that when something disturbs them, a voice, a closing door, the rustle of a blanket, that disturbance moves outward in waves reaching your ear, where it is finally translated into something the brain understands as sound. Without air, none of that travels anywhere at all. This is part of why the vacuum of space is often described as silent in the truest, most literal sense. Not quiet the way a library is quiet, but sound in a way that has no comparison here on Earth. There are no molecules out there to carry a wave, no medium for a voice or a footstep or the low creak of metal to move through. If you stood in that vacuum and someone beside you screamed as loudly as they possibly could, you would hear absolutely nothing. Not a whisper, not a hum, only the sound of your own breathing moving briefly through the small pocket of air trapped inside a suit before it too fades. Astronauts who have walked on the surface of the moon have spoken about this in quiet, almost reflective terms. The moon has essentially no atmosphere, and so their footsteps, their tools striking the ground, the soft shifting of lunar dust beneath their boots produced no sound at all outside their suits. Everything they heard came instead through a radio carried electronically rather than physically, voices arriving not through the air around them, but through a small speaker resting close to the ear. It seems that even walking felt different there, not simply lighter in that lower gravity, but strangely soundless, stripped of the ordinary sensory backdrop that a body on Earth has never had to live without. There is something quietly unsettling and also strangely peaceful in imagining that kind of silence. A world where movement leaves no echo, where nothing you do makes a sound unless you choose to send it somewhere else entirely. Psychologists often note that complete silence, the kind with absolutely nothing filling, It can feel unfamiliar to the human nervous system in a way that gentle background sound does not. Many people, when placed in a fully soundproofed room for even a short while, describe the experience as strange, even mildly disorienting. The mind, it seems, is not built for true silence. It is built for a world with texture in it. Wind moving through leaves, rain against glass, the low, constant murmur of air itself, brushing invisibly against every surface it touches. Maybe that is part of why so many people fall asleep more easily with a small sound nearby. A fan, rain against a window, a quiet voice speaking slowly somewhere close. The brain tends to interpret a little sound, evenly spread, evenly repeated, as safety, as a sign that the world around it is still moving, still present, still there. Without an atmosphere, that entire layer of experience simply would not exist. Not because anything would feel wrong exactly, but because there would be nothing there at all to carry it. And sound is only one half of what air quietly carries for us. The other half is warmth. Studies indicate that the atmosphere plays an enormous role in regulating temperature across the surface of this planet, holding heat close during the night and softening the intensity of the sun during the day. It behaves in a way like a thin, breathable blanket, one that never quite lets the warmth of daylight escape too quickly and never lets the cold of night settle too deeply either. The moon once again offers a quiet contrast. With almost no atmosphere to hold or moderate temperature, its surface swings between extremes that would feel almost impossible here. During the lunar day, temperatures can rise past 250 degrees Fahrenheit. During the lunar night, they can fall below negative 200 degrees. No gentle transition between the two, no atmosphere there to soften the edges, just an abrupt total shift the moment the sun disappears below the horizon. Here on Earth, that shift is far gentler because the atmosphere itself absorbs and redistributes heat, holding a portion of the sun's warmth, even after it has set, releasing it slowly through the night rather than all at once. This is part of why deserts with their thin, dry air tend to feel intensely hot during the day, and surprisingly cold after dark. There is simply less moisture in the atmosphere there to hold on to the heat once the sun has gone. It may be that this quiet regulation is one of the least noticed gifts of the atmosphere. Not the air itself, but its patience, its willingness to hold warmth just long enough and release it just slowly enough that the difference between day and night never feels violent. Only a soft transition, a gradual dimming rather than a sudden drop. Neuroscientists have observed that gradual changes, whether in light temperature or sound, tend to be processed by the body as calming, while abrupt changes tend to trigger alertness, even mild stress. In that sense, perhaps the atmosphere has been quietly training the human body for as long as bodies have existed here to associate the passing of a day with softness rather than shock. Warm light fading slowly into cool blue, heat lingering a little even after the sun has gone. There is a particular stillness in that thought, that some part of the reason evenings feel peaceful, the reason a slow sunset can settle something in the chest, may be owed in part to a layer of gas above you, quietly holding on to warmth just a little longer than it strictly needs to. The mind quietly registers comfort in patterns like this, even without understanding the mechanism behind them. A slow fade, a gentle hush, a world where sound can travel gently between two people, and where the warmth of one day does not disappear the instant the light does. None of this asks to be understood completely tonight. It is enough to simply notice it. The quiet hum around you, the soft, lingering warmth beneath your blanket. Both of them borrowed in some small way from an atmosphere that has been holding these things gently in place for longer than any of us have been here to notice. And underneath all of that quieter still, there is the question of what the body itself would feel moment by moment if that gentle holding were ever taken away. The body, it turns out, has never once had to think about the air pressing against it. Not because that pressure is small, but because it has always been there evenly from every direction for as long as any of us have existed. It is only in imagining its absence that the mind begins to notice just how much quiet work that pressure has been doing all along. Scientists suggest that the human body is in many ways built around this invisible balance. Every cell, every vessel, every soft tissue beneath the skin exists in a kind of equilibrium with the air outside it. The pressure pushing in from the atmosphere is matched almost perfectly by pressure pushing out from within. Neither side notices the other because neither side has ever had to. It is a stillness born from balance rather than the absence of force. There is a particular altitude high above the ground where scientists have given this balance a quiet name. It is called the Armstrong limit, resting somewhere around 63,000 feet, nearly 12 miles above the surface. Above that line, the atmosphere thins so completely that its pressure can no longer keep water inside the body in its liquid form. It seems that at that height, without protection, the moisture on exposed skin and in the softer tissues of the body would begin to change, not violently, not instantly, but through a slow process closer to evaporation than anything more sudden. The body would not explode the way old films once imagined. It would simply lose its balance, gently and completely, the pressure it had always leaned on no longer there to hold it. It is a strange kind of vulnerability to sit with, that something as constant as pressure, something never felt, never questioned, could be the quiet reason the body holds its shape at all. Researchers have found that pilots and early high-altitude test flyers were among the first to encounter this limit directly, which is part of why pressurized suits and cabins became so essential to flight above a certain height. Even now, commercial airplanes cruising far above the clouds maintain an artificial pressure inside the cabin roughly equivalent to what the body would feel at 8,000 feet, rather than the actual altitude outside. Passengers rarely think about this. They simply feel the soft pop in their ears during ascent, a brief adjustment, and then forget the moment entirely. But that quiet adjustment is the body responding to one of the few times in ordinary life it is asked to notice pressure at all. The mind quietly registers most of this as background, the way it registers breathing or blinking or the beating of a heart. Not because it is unimportant, but because the nervous system has learned over a very long time that certain things do not need constant attention in order to keep working. There is another quiet fact resting just beneath this one, softer, and perhaps a little more intimate. The human body is by weight made mostly of water, and water, like everything else, behaves differently depending on the pressure surrounding it. At the pressure we live in every day, water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. But pressure and boiling point are closely tied together, more closely than most people ever consider. As pressure drops, the temperature required for boiling drops with it. High in the mountains where the air is thinner, water boils at a noticeably lower temperature, which is part of why food sometimes takes longer to cook at altitude. The reduced pressure allows the water to shift into vapor more easily, even without additional heat. Carried far enough into the thin edges of the upper atmosphere, this same principle applies to the fluids within the human body. At low enough pressure, body temperature alone becomes enough to begin that same transformation. Not because anything is unusually hot, but because there is no longer enough pressure holding the liquid state together. It is a delicate thought and not one meant to unsettle. If anything, it is closer to a kind of quiet appreciation that the comfortable stillness of an ordinary evening, the simple, unremarkable fact of a body sitting calmly breathing, evenly existing without strain, depends on a precise and invisible balance that has been maintained around you every day of your life without a single moment of conscious effort. Psychologists often note that people tend to feel safest in environments that require no active maintenance from them. A room at a comfortable temperature, a cushion that holds its shape, air that simply behaves the way air is supposed to behave. It may be that this sense of ease is not simply psychological, but something closer to a body finally being allowed to stop monitoring its surroundings, because everything around it is already quietly correct. This same pressure plays a gentler role too in something far more familiar, in sound which we've already let drift past us earlier tonight, in the slight comfortable weight you may feel resting against your chest as you lie still, in the way a deep breath expands the lungs against a resistance so consistent that it barely registers as resistance at all. What we understand so far suggests that this steady outer pressure actually assists certain bodily processes, helping maintain the shape of blood vessels, supporting circulation in small continuous ways that would be disrupted entirely in its absence. There is something worth resting on in that idea, that even something as vast and impersonal as atmospheric pressure has in its own quiet way been gently supportive. Not because it was designed to be, simply because life adapted over an immense stretch of time to move in harmony with it, the way water settles into the shape of whatever holds it. Evidence suggests that astronauts, upon returning to Earth after extended time in the reduced pressure and altered gravity of space, often describe a strange heaviness in their first days back. Not simply from gravity returning, but from the body slowly readjusting to the fuller familiar pressure of an atmosphere it had briefly left behind. Blood pressure shifts, fluid distribution changes, the body in a sense has to relearn something it once knew instinctively. It seems that even something as steady and invisible as air pressure carries its own kind of memory held quietly within the body itself. For now there is nothing further to reach for in this thought. Only the quiet fact of your own body resting somewhere warm, held gently in place by a pressure it has never once had to think about, and likely never will. There is a quieter layer to this, though, one that has less to do with pressure or water and much more to do with something that happens the moment air itself simply isn't there anymore. There is a colour above you right now that you have likely never questioned. Blue, ordinary familiar, so constant across a lifetime of daytime skies that it barely registers as something worth wondering about. And yet that colour is not actually a property of the sky itself. It is something the atmosphere is quietly doing moment by moment entirely on your behalf. Scientists suggest that sunlight, though it appears white to the human eye, is actually made up of every colour at once blended together so completely that the individual parts disappear into a single soft glow. When that light enters the atmosphere, it collides with the countless tiny molecules of nitrogen and oxygen filling the air. And here is the quiet detail most people never learn. Shorter wavelengths of light, the blues and violets, scatter far more easily off these small molecules than the longer wavelengths like reds and oranges. This scattering happens in every direction, bouncing blue light across the entire sky again and again, until it seems to be coming from everywhere at once. That is the blue you have been looking up at your whole life. Not the sky itself, but sunlight quietly scattered into fragments, softened and spread by the very air that also lets you breathe. It seems that violet light actually scatters even more than blue. But human eyes are simply more sensitive to blue wavelengths, and part of that light gets absorbed higher in the atmosphere before it ever reaches us. So the sky settles into the particular familiar blue most of us have never thought twice about. A colour built almost entirely by accident, shaped by the way light interacts with something we cannot see. There is something quietly moving in that the colour layered across every ordinary day of your life is not something painted onto the world, but something happening actively, continuously in the thin air above you. A soft, invisible performance repeated every single morning whether or not anyone looks up to notice it. The mind quietly registers colour as simply a feature of things. The sky is blue, the grass is green. It rarely occurs to most people that this blue is conditional, dependent entirely on air being there at all. Without an atmosphere, sunlight would have nothing to scatter against. There would be no soft diffusion, no gentle bending of light into colour. The sky, even at high noon, even with the sun blazing directly overhead, would simply be black. Not dark blue, not deep violet. Black, the same black that fills the space between stars with the sun sitting in the middle of it like an impossibly bright hole cut into the darkness. Astronauts who have travelled beyond the atmosphere often describe this exact moment. Not gradually, not slowly, but as something that happens almost the instant they rise high enough. The sky simply stops being blue. It becomes the same endless black that surrounds the entire planet, and the stars, usually hidden by daylight scattering here on the ground, appear constantly, even with the sun fully visible nearby. Daytime and nighttime in a sense dissolve into the same unbroken darkness once the air is no longer there to separate them. Researchers have found that this particular fact tends to surprise people more than almost any other detail about the atmosphere. Most assume the sky would simply grow darker without air, perhaps closer to twilight. But it would not soften that way. It would shift completely and immediately into the same star-filled blackness that fills every photograph ever taken from space. There is a strange quiet vulnerability in imagining that. A sky that offers no gentle transition between day and night, no soft fading of blue into orange into deep violet. The way it happens here every single evening, whether or not anyone is watching. Just an abrupt total stillness. Black and then black again. Psychologists often note that gradual visual transitions like a slow sunset tend to have a measurable calming effect on the nervous system. The soft shift of colour across the horizon seems to signal in some old wordless part of the brain that time is moving gently, predictably, safely. It may be that the colour of the sky itself has been quietly shaping human emotion for as long as human beings have existed without either side ever fully realising it. And there is one more part of this quiet colour story resting just beneath the surface of what most people notice. At sunrise and sunset, when sunlight has to travel through a much greater stretch of atmosphere to reach your eyes, most of the blue light scatters away entirely before it arrives, leaving behind the warmer reds and oranges that manage to survive the longer journey. This is why the sky at dusk glows so differently from the sky at noon. Not because the light itself has changed, but because the angle has changed, and with it how much air that light has had to pass through, and how much of it has been quietly filtered away before reaching you. Evidence suggests that this particular shift in colour, the slow warming of the sky toward evening, is deeply tied to circadian rhythm regulation in the human body. The changing light does not simply look different. It sends a quiet biological signal gently nudging the body toward rest, long before conscious thought ever catches up to the idea of being tired. There is something tender in imagining that the sky has been speaking to the body this entire time in a language older than words. A shift in colour as a quiet suggestion. Slow down, soften, let go a little more. Without an atmosphere, that entire conversation would fall silent. No warm fading at dusk. No soft blue deepening into violet. Only the same fixed blackness unchanging regardless of the hour, offering the body no gentle cue at all that a day has ended or that rest might be near. There is a quieter layer to this though, one that most people never consider tucked somewhere just beneath the colour of the sky itself. In the way the body seems to already know things the mind has not yet caught up to. There is a particular warmth that settles over a room at night, one most people never trace back to its actual source. Not the blanket, not the heater humming somewhere nearby. Something older than both of those things, something that has been holding warmth close to this planet for longer than warmth itself has had anywhere else to go. Scientists suggest that a portion of the sunlight reaching Earth each day does not simply pass through and disappear. Much of it strikes the surface, warms the ground, the water, the pavement, the soil, and then radiates back outward again. Not as visible light this time, but as a gentler form of energy, infrared heat, rising quietly into the sky. Certain gases in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, water vapor, methane, among a few others, happen to be very good at catching that outgoing heat before it escapes completely into space. They absorb it, hold it briefly, and release it again in every direction, including back down toward the surface. This is the quiet mechanism researchers call the greenhouse effect. Not a wall, not a barrier. More like a slow, gentle catch and release happening, continuously keeping a portion of the day's warmth from slipping away all at once the moment the sun sets. It seems that without this effect, the average temperature of the Earth's surface would sit somewhere near 0 degrees Fahrenheit, rather than the mild, comfortable range most of the planet enjoys. The difference between a livable world and a frozen one turns out to rest on something almost invisible, a thin scattering of specific molecules doing quiet, repetitive work in the air above every one of us every day without pause. There is something oddly touching in that. That warmth, the kind felt curled beneath blankets, the kind that makes evenings feel soft rather than sharp, depends on a process most people will go their entire lives without ever picturing. Heat rising, gases gently catching it, warmth settling back down again and again like something patient tending a low, steady flame. Now let the mind drift toward what happens when that quiet mechanism disappears entirely. If the atmosphere were suddenly gone, there would be no gases left to catch that outgoing heat. Nothing to hold the warmth of the day close to the surface once the sun dipped below the horizon. Evidence suggests that in such a scenario, nighttime temperatures would fall with startling speed, not over the slow curve of hours the way an ordinary evening cools, but far more rapidly since there would be no insulating layer left to soften the drop at all. During the day, without an atmosphere to scatter and diffuse sunlight, the sun's direct rays would strike the surface with far greater intensity since none of that light would be softened along the way. Surfaces facing the sun could grow extremely hot, while surfaces in shadow just a short distance away could plunge into severe cold almost instantly. There would be no gentle atmospheric blending between the two. It may be that this is one of the more unsettling parts of imagining a world without air. Not a single overwhelming disaster, but an extreme jagged instability. Blistering heat in direct sunlight. Sudden severe cold the moment shadow falls. No soft transitions anywhere. No twilight easing one into the other. Only sharp immediate contrast over and over everywhere across the surface. The moon once more offers a quiet real-world glimpse of this. Without any atmosphere to regulate its surface temperature, it swings between scorching daytime heat and brutal nighttime cold, with almost nothing gentle happening in between. Studies indicate that the temperature can shift by several hundred degrees within a matter of hours, simply because there is no atmospheric blanket there to hold warmth or to soften intensity in either direction. The brain tends to associate extremes like this with danger even in imagination alone. Sudden shifts, sharp edges, nothing gradual to hold on to. Perhaps that discomfort is not simply psychological. Perhaps it echoes something deeper, some old wordless recognition that gentle transitions, gradual temperature, soft, fading light, have always been part of what allowed life to settle safely into rhythm here. There is a particular kind of cold, too, that deserves its own quiet mention. Not simply the cold of night, but the cold of empty space itself, which the atmosphere has always stood between us, and so completely that most people never think to be grateful for the distance. The vacuum beyond Earth's atmosphere sits at an extraordinarily low temperature, hovering near absolute law in the shaded regions untouched by direct sunlight. Researchers have found that without the atmosphere acting as a buffer, heat from the surface would radiate outward into that vast cold almost unchecked, especially in areas without direct sun. The warmth of an ordinary day would have nowhere stable to rest. It would simply drain away into a cold with no bottom, no edge, nothing to slow its escape. It seems strange to think of warmth as something that needs protecting, but that may be exactly what the atmosphere has been quietly doing this entire time. Not creating warmth, simply refusing to let it leave too quickly. Holding it the way a cupped hand holds a small flame against the wind, not adding anything to the fire, only shielding it long enough to survive the night. Psychologists often note that a sense of being sheltered physically or emotionally tends to lower stress responses in the body almost immediately. It may be that this feeling, this quiet background sense of shelter most people carry without ever naming it, has some distant root in exactly this. A planet that does not let its warmth disappear too quickly. A sky that holds on gently on your behalf every single night. There is also a slower, longer version of this same story, one that unfolds not across a single day, but across an entire year. The tilt of the Earth, combined with the atmosphere's ability to redistribute heat through wind and moisture, is part of why seasons shift gradually rather than violently. Warm air moves toward cooler regions, moisture travels with it, temperatures ease from summer into autumn, rather than snapping abruptly from one extreme to another. What we understand so far suggests that even something as vast as a season depends in part on the same quiet mechanism that keeps a single night from turning suddenly and completely cold. For now, there is nothing more to reach for in this thought, only the quiet knowledge that somewhere above you, an invisible layer of gas is still holding on to warmth on your behalf, gently, patiently, the way it always has long before there was anyone here to notice, and long after most people stop thinking about it each night before sleep. And beneath all of that warmth there is something else the atmosphere has been quietly holding in place, something closer to fitter than to heat, something that touches almost every living thing on this planet in ways most people rarely pause to consider. There is a sound that exists in almost every quiet memory of rain. The soft tap against a window, the low hush of it falling somewhere out of sight. Most people never think of rain as something dependent on air itself, and yet without the atmosphere that particular sound, that particular comfort would have no way of existing at all. Scientists suggest that water on Earth exists in a very particular kind of balance, one made possible almost entirely by atmospheric pressure. At the pressure we live in, everyday water is free to exist in three familiar forms: solid ice, liquid water and vapor, shifting between them depending on temperature. This flexibility, ordinary as it feels, is not something every world gets to have. It depends entirely on there being enough pressure pressing down on that water to keep it stable as a liquid in the first place. Without the atmosphere, that pressure would vanish almost immediately. And what we understand so far suggests that deprived of enough pressure to hold it in liquid form, the water covering most of this planet would begin behaving very differently. Surface water exposed directly to a vacuum would begin to boil, even at relatively low temperatures, not from added heat, but simply from the loss of pressure holding it together as a liquid at all. At the very same time, without an atmosphere to retain warmth, temperatures at the surface would also be dropping rapidly, especially in shadow. Oceans caught in this strange contradictory space, boiling in sunlight, freezing in shade, losing pressure everywhere at once. It is a strange image to sit with, water doing two seemingly opposite things simultaneously, not because the water itself has changed, but because the delicate agreement between pressure, temperature, and molecular structure that allows water to simply be water calmly, quietly, has been taken away. There is something almost tender in realizing how much rests on that agreement. That the rain against a window, the mist rising softly off a lake at dawn, the simple, unremarkable glass of water beside a bed at night, all depend on an invisible layer of gas, holding just enough pressure in place to let water settle comfortably into its liquid form. Researchers have found that this same atmospheric partnership is responsible for something even larger, something most people picture without ever really tracing its mechanics: the water cycle. Sunlight warms the surface of oceans, lakes and rivers, and a portion of that water quietly transforms into vapor, rising invisibly into the air above. As that vapor rises higher into cooler layers of the atmosphere, it condenses, gathering into the soft drifting shapes we call clouds, eventually gathered densely enough that moisture falls back to the surface as rain or snow, beginning the entire slow cycle again. It seems that none of this could happen without an atmosphere to carry that moisture upward, cool it, and eventually release it. Water itself does not simply choose to rise and fall in this graceful repeating pattern. Air does that work quietly, continuously, an invisible current lifting and lowering the same water again and again in a cycle so old it predates almost everything living on this planet. The mind quietly registers rain as something simple, something almost taken for granted. But it may be that few things reveal the atmosphere's quiet architecture more clearly than a single passing storm. Moisture rising unseen from some distant ocean, carried for miles on slow currents of air, cooling gradually into cloud, and finally releasing softly as the very rain someone somewhere is listening to right now while falling asleep. There is a particular comfort many people associate with that sound rain against glass, especially at night. Psychologists often note that consistent gentle background sound, especially with the soft repetitive rhythm, tends to ease the nervous system into a calmer state, often described as similar to the effect of white noise. It may be that rain holds a particularly strong version of this effect, not simply because of its rhythm, but because some quiet ancestral part of the mind associates the sound of rain with safety, shelter and rest going back further than memory can trace. Without an atmosphere, that entire experience would not exist. No moisture rising, no clouds drifting slowly across a horizon, no soft percussion against glass in the middle of the night. Only a dry, unmoving silence and a surface locked into extremes without the gentle mediating presence of water moving quietly between sky and ground. There is a deeper vulnerability tucked inside this thought as well, one that reaches beyond comfort and touches something closer to survival itself. Evidence suggests that nearly every form of life on this planet depends in some way on liquid water remaining stable and accessible, not simply for drinking but for the countless quiet chemical processes happening inside every living cell, processes that require water to remain in its liquid form in order to function at all. If the atmosphere disappeared and water could no longer hold its liquid state, that foundation would begin to erode almost immediately. Not through any single dramatic event, but through the quiet failure of thousands of small essential processes, all of them dependent on the same fragile agreement between air pressure and water that most people will never once think about across an entire lifetime. It seems that so much of what feels stable, so much of what feels safe and ordinary rests on partnerships this quiet. Pressure and water, warmth and air, none of it loud, none of it announced, just a long, patient collaboration holding a livable world together, one unnoticed moment at a time. There is also a slower rhythm hidden inside all of this one that unfolds across seasons rather than single storms. Atmospheric currents carry moisture from warm oceans towards its drier regions, feeding rivers, filling underground reserves, shaping the slow cyclical rhythm of wet seasons and dry ones. Entire ecosystems have grown around this rhythm, entire patterns of migration, of blooming, of quiet seasonal change, all shaped by an atmosphere gently moving water from one place to another again and again for longer than any living memory could hold. For now, there is nothing more to reach for in this thought, only the quiet knowledge that somewhere right now, invisible currents of air are lifting moisture gently upward, carrying it slowly across unseen distances, preparing perhaps to become rain somewhere far from here, long before anyone below ever notices the sky beginning to change. And it may be that this quiet cycle, water rising, drifting, falling, rising again, holds something a little further inside it too. A kind of rhythm that other worlds without air were never given the chance to keep at all. There is a planet not so very far from here that once may have looked almost like this one. Rivers once carved paths across its surface. Lakes may have gathered in its lowlands. And somewhere in its ancient past it likely had an atmosphere thick enough to hold warmth and pressure, and perhaps even rain in something close to the way this planet still does. That planet is Mars. And scientists suggest that what happened to it slowly over billions of years may be one of the closest real examples we have of a world quietly losing what Earth still keeps. Researchers have found that Mars, unlike Earth, no longer generates a strong global magnetic field. Its core cooled and settled far earlier in its history, and without that churning motion inside the magnetic shielding that once likely surrounded the planet gradually faded. Without that shield, the solar wind, the same steady stream of charged particles that Earth's magnetic field quietly deflects every day, was left free to reach Mars directly unblocked for an immense stretch of time. Evidence suggests that this exposure slowly stripped away much of Mars's original atmosphere particle by particle across hundreds of millions of years. Not suddenly, not violently, just a long quiet erosion the same way wind might slowly wear down the edge of a stone so gradually that from any single moment nothing would appear to be happening at all. It seems that what remains today is only a thin whisper of what once surrounded that planet, an atmosphere so faint that its surface pressure is less than 1% of what we experience here on Earth. Standing on Mars without protection, a person would not simply feel cold. The pressure would be low enough that, much like the upper edges of Earth's own atmosphere, it could no longer keep water or the fluids within a body in their liquid state at all. There is something quietly haunting in that image. A planet that may have once had blue skies of its own oceans, perhaps even rain, slowly losing the very thing that made all of it possible. Not through any single catastrophe, but through the patient, invisible work of an unshielded sky, thinning a little more with every passing millennium. The mind quietly registers Mars when it registers it at all as a red, dusty, distant place. Rarely does it register as a warning or as a mirror. And yet what we understand so far suggests that it may be exactly that. A quiet demonstration of what a magnetic field's absence can do to a world over enough time. A world not so different once from the one currently holding you warm and breathing beneath a sky that has so far managed to hold on. It is worth pausing here gently, not with worry, but with a kind of quiet appreciation. Earth's magnetic field remains active today, generated by the slow churn of molten metal deep within its core, a process expected to continue for a very long stretch of time still ahead. Studies indicate that this protection is not something fragile or something likely to change within any time frame that should concern an ordinary evening like this one. It is simply worth noticing tonight as something Mars quietly lost, and something Earth, for now, still quietly keeps. There is another kind of memory tucked into this story as well, one written not in atmosphere but in stone. Geologists studying the surface of Mars have found dry riverbeds curling gently across the landscape the way rivers curl here on Earth. They have found mineral deposits that typically only form in the presence of liquid water. They have found what appear to be ancient lake basins, and even signs of what may once have been a shoreline stretching along a region some scientists believe was once covered by a shallow northern ocean. None of that water remains today, at least not in liquid form. Some of it likely escaped into space, carried away alongside the fading atmosphere. Some of it researchers believe may still exist, frozen deep beneath the surface, locked away in ice that has waited silently for longer than human history has existed to measure. It seems that Mars did not simply lose its atmosphere in some abrupt, forgettable moment. It lost an entire version of itself slowly, the kind of world it might have remained had its core continued turning a little longer. Had its shield continued holding a little longer, had its sky simply been given a little more time? There is a quiet kind of grief in that thought, though not the sharp kind, something softer. The kind of feeling that comes from imagining a life that almost happened rather than one that painfully ended. A world that drifted gently away from possibility, rather than one that was violently taken from it. And there is something in that quiet drifting away that feels strangely close to what happens inside a person too, somewhere near the edge of sleep. Thoughts loosening, edges softening, nothing dramatic pulling them apart, just a slow, patient release. One small piece at a time until what remains is something quieter, thinner, further from where it started without ever feeling like a single sudden moment. Psychologists often note the human mind rarely experiences major internal shifts as one sharp turning point. Grief softens slowly, comfort settles in gradually. Even falling asleep is not a single instant but a long layered drifting the mind, letting go of one thread at a time the way perhaps an atmosphere might let go of one particle at a time across a scale far too vast for any single moment to notice. Mars in that sense is not simply a dead planet. It is a slow planetary memory of letting go written across billions of years, patient and enormous, but built from the same kind of small, quiet, cumulative release that shapes so much of what happens here too, in far smaller, far gentler ways almost every single night. The mind, it seems, has been keeping something still and patient all along, a quiet thread linking a red distant world to the soft, familiar weight of the body resting right here, right now, beneath a sky that has not yet had to let go of anything at all. Even in the quiet imagining of a world stripped of its atmosphere, life, it seems, would not disappear all at once. Scientists suggest that certain small, remarkably resilient forms of life might continue on tucked into the few remaining pockets where conditions stayed survivable long after the sky above them had gone silent. There is a particular creature worth resting on for a moment, one so small it would fit comfortably on the head of a pin, and yet so resilient that researchers have found it can survive conditions that would end almost any other form of life almost instantly. The tardigrade, sometimes called the water bear, is capable of entering a state scientists refer to as cryptobiosis, essentially pausing its own metabolism, almost entirely curling into a dry dormant form that can withstand extreme cold, extreme heat, and even the vacuum of space itself. Studies indicate that tardigrades have been exposed directly to the vacuum and radiation of space during scientific experiments, and a meaningful portion of them survived the experience later, reviving once returned to more hospitable conditions. It seems that somewhere inside that tiny, unremarkable body is a kind of patience so complete it can simply wait out conditions that would erase almost everything else, holding on to the faintest thread of life until the world around it becomes livable again. There is something quietly moving in that image. Not strength in the way we usually imagine it, not resistance, not force, but stillness. A willingness to simply stop to hold to wait rather than struggle against something impossible to overcome directly. Deep beneath the surface of the Earth, researchers have found other forms of life that never depended on the atmosphere in the way most living things do. Around hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor in complete darkness under crushing pressure, certain microorganisms survive not through sunlight or oxygen from the air above, but through chemosynthesis, drawing energy instead from chemical reactions involving minerals, seeping up from the Earth's molten interior. These organisms have never needed a blue sky or breathable air, or gentle sunlight filtering down from above. They have built an entire quiet existence around a completely different kind of nourishment altogether. It seems that if the atmosphere were lost, environments like these deep in the ocean or far beneath the surface of the ground might remain among the last quiet refuges where certain forms of life could continue insulated by rock and water from the harshest changes happening above. Not thriving perhaps in any abundant sense, but persisting, enduring in the particular patient way that life so often seems to prefer over disappearing entirely. There is a kind of comfort tucked into that thought, even inside a scenario built from imagination rather than expectation. That life across the whole history of this planet has rarely responded to hardship with sudden collapse. More often, evidence suggests it responds by retreating, adapting, tucking itself into whatever quiet corner remains survivable, and waiting there sometimes for a very long time until conditions shift again. Psychologists often note something strangely similar in human resilience as well, that people facing prolonged hardship do not usually respond with constant visible strength. More often they retreat inward, conserve what they can hold steady in whatever small protected space remains available to them, and simply continue quietly without needing anyone to witness the effort involved in doing so. Perhaps that is part of why stories like the tardigrade or the deep-sea vent feel oddly comforting rather than bleak. Not because they promise survival no matter what, but because they offer a quiet reminder that endurance rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like stillness, like waiting, like a small patient shape curled inward, simply outlasting a storm it cannot fight directly. There are spores too produced by certain bacteria that scientists have found can remain dormant for extraordinarily long stretches of time. Sometimes many thousands of years, sealed away in ice or salt or deep sediment, only to revive again once conditions become favourable. Neuroscientists have observed that even human memory holds a distant echo of this same principle. Certain thoughts, certain feelings lying dormant for years, seemingly forgotten, only to return fully intact the instant the right condition brings them gently back to the surface. It may be that dormancy itself, whether in a spore, a tardigrade, or a quiet memory resting somewhere in the back of the mind, is not truly the opposite of life or thought. It may simply be another form of patience, a willingness to wait protected until the world outside becomes gentle enough to return to. If the atmosphere disappeared most complex life, certainly anything resembling a plant or a bird or the body currently resting somewhere warm right now would not be able to survive unprotected for very long. The absence of oxygen, of pressure, of warmth would be far too immediate, far too complete. But it seems the deepest, most fundamental threads of life, the smallest, oldest, most patient forms of it might continue on, regardless, tucked into rock, into ice, into the lightless corners of the ocean floor, holding on in the quiet, persistent way life has always seemed to know how to do best. There is something worth sitting with in that even in the most complete kind of loss imaginable, something small, something patient, something curled inward and waiting might still remain. Not thriving, not building anything grand, just persisting quietly the way certain things always seem to. What we understand so far suggests that this same pattern echoes gently in something Earth itself has already survived before several times over, though never quite as completely as losing an atmosphere altogether. Mass extinctions, sudden climate shifts, entire eras, where most life on the surface disappeared almost entirely, and yet each time something small, something hidden, something patient enough to wait in the dark carried a thread of life forward into whatever came next. It is a quiet inheritance in a way, that the very fact you are here breathing calmly right now, wrapped in warmth, resting beneath an intact and generous sky, exists because something somewhere long before you chose to endure rather than disappear completely, patiently enough, for long enough that life eventually found its way back to open air and colour and rain and everything that followed after. And perhaps that same quiet, patient rhythm exists somewhere within the body resting right now too. A stillness that does not need to fight anything tonight, only to rest and wait and let the next slow turn arrive gently on its own. There is a rhythm running beneath everything we have wandered through tonight, one far too slow for any single lifetime to witness completely, and yet steady enough that it has held this entire story together without ever once breaking stride. Scientists suggest that deep within the Earth, far beneath the crust, beneath the mantle, there lies a core divided into two distinct layers, a solid inner core and a molten outer core made mostly of iron and nickel. That outer layer is not still. It moves in slow massive currents shaped by heat rising from the planet's centre and by the Earth's own rotation churning in patterns that have continued largely unbroken for roughly 4.5 billion years. This motion is often called the geodynamo, and researchers have found that it is the quiet engine behind the planet's entire magnetic field, the same invisible shield that has been gently deflecting solar wind this whole time, keeping the atmosphere from slowly drifting away the way it eventually did on Mars. It is strange to think of something so vast, so ancient, so completely hidden from view as the reason something as ordinary as tonight's quiet air continues to exist at all. It seems that this rhythm is not perfectly constant either. Evidence suggests that Earth's magnetic field has weakened and strengthened many times across its long history, and even reversed entirely on occasion, north becoming south, south becoming north, in a slow, gradual process that can take thousands of years to complete. These reversals leave behind their own quiet record locked into certain volcanic rocks that formed as magma cooled, and in doing so captured the direction of the magnetic field at that exact moment, holding it frozen in stone ever since. There is something almost meditative in imagining that. A planet's entire magnetic orientation slowly turning over across millennia, so slowly that no living thing at the time would have noticed any change at all. Just the ordinary passage of days one after another, while somewhere far beneath their feet an ancient rhythm continued reshaping itself patiently and visibly, the way certain deep parts of a person might shift and settle too, so gradually across a life that the shift itself is never really felt, only recognized much later looking backward. The mind quietly registers stability as something static, something unchanging. But it may be that true stability, the kind capable of protecting a planet or a person across a very long stretch of time, is not stillness at all. It is rhythm. Movement repeated steadily enough, consistently enough, that it becomes something reliable, even while never actually stopping. There is another cycle worth resting on here too, one that moves even more slowly than the magnetic field itself, unfolding across hundreds of millions of years rather than mere thousands. Studies indicate that the very composition of the atmosphere is tied to a much larger, much slower process called the carbon cycle, in which carbon moves continuously between the air, the ocean's living organisms, and deep within the rock of the Earth itself. Volcanic activity releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from deep underground. Rain over enormous stretches of time slowly draws some of that carbon back down, dissolving it into rock formations, locking it away again, sometimes for millions of years, before geological processes eventually release it once more. It seems that the atmosphere in this sense is not a fixed, finished thing at all. It is something closer to breath, expanding, contracting, exchanged slowly with rock and ocean and life itself, in a rhythm so patient that from any single human perspective it appears completely still. And yet researchers have found that this slow exchange has been part of what has kept Earth's climate broadly stable enough, for long enough for life to continue developing across billions of years, even through significant shifts in the sun's own intensity over that same span of time. There is a quiet parallel in that too worth letting settle gently rather than examining too closely. That balance, real balance, the kind that holds steady across a very long time, rarely comes from nothing changing at all. It comes from constant, patient exchange, giving a little, receiving a little, release and then slow return, not unlike a body breathing quietly through the night, chest rising, then falling, then rising again, each breath slightly different from the last, and yet together forming something that feels from the outside like perfect stillness. Plate tectonics plays its own slow part in this rhythm as well. The Earth's outer shell is broken into large plates drifting almost imperceptibly across the mantle beneath them, at a pace often compared to the speed at which fingernails grow. Over vast stretches of time, this movement recycles material between the surface and the deep interior, releasing gases through volcanic activity and gradually reshaping the very geography of continents and oceans. It seems that even the shape of the world beneath your feet has never truly been fixed. It is simply moving too slowly for a single lifetime to notice. Neuroscientists have observed that the human mind tends to interpret anything moving slower than a certain threshold as essentially unchanging even when real continuous motion is happening the entire time. A shadow moving across a room during a long afternoon, the slow arc of stars overhead across a single night. None of these register as movement in the moment, only as change once enough time has quietly passed for the difference to become visible. Perhaps that the atmosphere and the deep planetary rhythm sustaining it exists somewhere in that same quiet category. Never still, not truly. Always breathing, always exchanging, always turning gently beneath the surface of things. Simply moving too slowly, too gently, for a single human moment to ever fully catch it in the act. There is comfort resting somewhere inside that thought, even without needing to reach for it directly, that the sky above you tonight is not a fixed, unchanging backdrop, but a living rhythm, thousands of millions of years deep, still continuing exactly as it has this entire time, holding warmth, holding pressure, holding the delicate, breathable balance that makes an evening like this one possible at all. It may be that some quiet, wordless part of the body already senses this rhythm, even without ever learning a single fact about magnetic fields or carbon cycles or the slow drift of continents. The same part that softens during a long, steady rainfall. The same part that settles more easily into rest beside a slow, even heartbeat rather than an irregular one. A recognition, perhaps, that rhythm itself, patient and unbroken, has always meant something safe. For now, there is nothing more to reach for in any of this. Only the quiet knowledge that somewhere far beneath you, an ancient rhythm continues turning gently in the dark exactly as it has for billions of years, asking nothing, expecting nothing, simply continuing the way breath continues, the way rest continues, the way this long, unhurried night is continuing our drifting a little further, a little softer toward its own quiet close. There is a photograph taken many years ago that some scientists consider one of the most quietly moving images ever captured from space. It shows the Earth from a great distance, small, pale, almost fragile against the vast darkness surrounding it. Astronauts have often described a similar feeling when looking back at the planet from orbit, a sense sometimes called the overview effect, where the atmosphere itself becomes visible, not as something invisible and assumed, but as a thin glowing band of blue, curving gently along the edge of the world. Researchers have found that from that distance, the entire atmosphere, everything we have spent this whole night wandering through together, the air carrying sound, the pressure holding, water steady, the ozone catching, ultraviolet light, the magnetic field turning far below appears as nothing more than a delicate glowing line, no thicker relative to the Earth itself than the skin of an apple resting gently in an open hand. It seems that many astronauts, upon seeing this for the first time, describe an unexpected quiet settling over them. Not fear at how thin that layer appears, something closer to tenderness, a sudden physical understanding that everything warm, everything breathable, everything blue and rain-soft and alive exists within a boundary so slender it could almost be missed entirely if you were not looking closely. That thin blue line has been curving gently around this planet for a very long time now, longer than any single life, longer than any single memory, holding warmth close on quiet nights like this one, letting rain fall softly enough to be heard through a window, keeping the sky a colour soft enough to rest beneath rather than a black and endless dark. And tonight none of that has asked anything of you. It has simply continued quietly the way it always does while you have been lying here listening, drifting a little further with each passing thought. There is nothing more to explain now, only to notice softly that it is still there, still holding, still turning gently somewhere far above the room around you. The night is thinning now the way certain thoughts do right before sleep finally arrives. Maybe it feels a little like air itself, present but no longer needing to be noticed. Somewhere above the sky keeps its quiet shape. Somewhere below the body settles a little deeper into stillness. Nothing needs to be understood any further tonight. Nothing needs to be held on to, just this. A slow breath in, a slower breath out. A thin blue line curved gently around a small sleeping world, and beneath it somewhere warm another small world resting too. Quiet now, soft now, drifting,